I know it's Easter, but I feel like all my Christmases have come at once. I discovered that Pilgrimage, the programme Pilgrimage, is back on the BBC. It's on Catch Up or iPlayer if you want to go and have a look. And Pilgrimage is where a bunch of celebrities from different faiths and beliefs, they go on a pilgrimage. And even better this time, they're going on a pilgrimage to Iona, which is a community very dear to my heart. It's a place I hope to get to one day. Do have a look. Scarlett Moffat, who'd have known? A devout Catholic, really, really serious about her faith. So go and have a look. It's really, really interesting. But pilgrimage can be a joy, but pilgrimage can be really, really difficult as well, really challenging, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. And especially when you've got a bunch of people travelling together who are from different faiths and beliefs, including a pagan, including a very extrovert pagan, then it can get challenging, it can get difficult, and there have been tears already. Which leads me beautifully onto the topic that we're thinking about today. Last week leads into today, really. Last week we were thinking about how the risen Jesus sends his followers out on a journey, on a pilgrimage. And this is what a pilgrimage of peace and forgiveness and reconciliation. And both of our readings today are very powerful stories of what that reconciliation looks like. So this is like where the rubber hits the road, as it were. Jesus last week sent his friends out, and this is what it looks like this week. We have two very powerful stories. First of all, Peter and Jesus, and then secondly, Ananias and Saul. Let's start with Peter and Jesus. Well, Jesus appears to Peter and some of the other disciples. The risen Jesus appears on a fishing trip, and he invites them to breakfast. And at this breakfast, he addresses the elephant in the room, or should I say the elephant on the beach. And that is Peter's disloyalty. Peter had let Jesus down badly. Peter had let Jesus down very badly. In the face of potential arrest, 3 times he had denied that he even knew Jesus, let alone standing up for him. Imagine the burden of guilt that Peter was carrying. And Jesus, in his grace and compassion, he was not going to ignore it. He was not going to sweep it under the carpet. He wasn't just going to say, water under the bridge and all of that. No, Peter had to be relieved, very deliberately relieved of that burden of guilt. And so Jesus asks him, "Do you love me?" 3 times, as many times as Peter had denied him. Now bear with me, it's worth looking at the Greek here, which doesn't come across in our English translation. When Jesus says, "Do you love me?" first of all, he uses the word which comes from the word agape, which is the Greek word meaning unconditional love. So Jesus is saying to Peter, "Do you love me unconditionally? Do you love me whatever?" And Peter replies, "Yes, you know that I love you," but the word he uses is the word philo. And philo is not as strong a word as the word that comes from agape. So if you like, Peter's saying, "Yeah, I really like you, Lord. You have my affection. I'm on your side, that kind of thing. I'm your friend." But he can't bring himself to say, "I love you unconditionally." He'd made those promises, hadn't he? "I'll go wherever you want, Jesus. I'll suffer with you. I'll die with you." And he hadn't been able to follow through on those promises. So he's learned his lesson. He's being more honest now. "Jesus, I love you, but I can't bring myself to say I love you unconditionally." Once again, Jesus asks, "Do you love me unconditionally?" And again, Peter replies the same way. "Yeah, Lord, I love you. I like you. I'm fond of you. You have my affection." 3rd time, Jesus asks, "Do you love me?" But now he uses the word philo. So Jesus, as it were, has come down to Peter's level. He accepts Jesus' imperfect and conditional love for him. Because Peter's finally had that moment of honesty. He's acknowledging that he's failed and that his love for Jesus is not perfect. And I find this really, really encouraging, because I bet there's not one person in this room who can say their love for Jesus is perfect. We're all flawed. We've all failed. And if we're honest, there are limits to our love for Jesus. But Jesus accepts that love nonetheless. I find that so beautiful and so encouraging. So having gone through this process, that burden of guilt is lifted. Peter is reinstated. Simon is reinstated to become Peter again, the rock. And he's given a commission. He's given this fresh commission. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, tend my flock. It's a beautiful, beautiful story. Our second story of reconciliation is Saul and Ananias. So the situation is that Saul is basically persecuting the early church, which interestingly is called the Way. So there you go. There's that whole idea of journey again and pilgrimage. But Saul is like, he's being like the religious police, big time. He's persecuting the early church because they're not kind of conforming to the old religion. He's dragging people to prison. He's doing all kinds of harm and mischief to the early church. And he has this experience on the road to Damascus. He wants to arrest more Christians. And he has this road to Damascus experience that it's in our language even now, even today, isn't it? We talk about a road to Damascus experience. This blinding light from heaven. And he's blinded. He's traumatized by the presence. What he says later on is that he saw this as meeting the risen Jesus. This was his encounter with the risen Jesus. It was a blinding light from heaven, and it was a voice saying, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And you'd think that that was enough. That was enough to convert Saul, to change Saul into Paul, that great missionary and planter of so many churches in the Mediterranean area. But no, a second thing had to happen. And this is where Ananias comes in. Ananias, who's just like, as far as we know, he's like a regular Christian living in Damascus. And God speaks to him and says, there's a guy called Saul in town at the moment. I want you to go. I want you to lay hands on him. I want you to pray for him. Can you imagine how that must have felt for Ananias? Ananias knew about Saul. He knew that he'd been persecuting the church. He knew that he was an enemy of the church. And you can imagine, well, he does protest. You know, this man, he's been persecuting the church. He's a man of violence. He's our enemy. Why should I do this? And God just repeats that command. Go. Go and pray for him, because I've got great plans for this person. And I wonder what would have happened if Ananias hadn't been obedient in this respect. I wonder what would have become of that early church without Saul becoming Paul. So, if you like, a huge chunk of our history, a huge chunk of our Western civilization founded on the Christian faith rests on this one disciple at this point and whether he's obedient. And imagine the courage it took for Ananias to seek this religious terrorist out and to lay his hands on him and to say those two beautiful words which changed history. Brother Saul. Brother Saul. Even though you're my enemy, you're my brother in Christ. And the rest is history. What have these two stories got in common? What they've got in common is that the offended reaches out to the offender. And that demands a lot. That demands an open heart. It demands an open mind. It demands an enormous amount of courage. It demands the kind of courage that took Jesus to the cross, as he died for all of humanity who have, one way or another, offended him and offended God. It demands the kind of courage behind those words on the cross. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. It's the kind of courage behind those words to that low-life criminal being crucified with him. Today you will be with me in paradise. It's the courage behind those words of Jesus to Peter, do you love me? And it's the courage behind those words of Ananias to Saul, brother Saul. Now, none of this should be a great surprise, because during his earthly ministry, we know, we sometimes forget, maybe conveniently, but we know that Jesus taught, love your enemies. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. It's a tough, tough teaching. It goes against all of our instincts. But as with all of his teaching, Jesus didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. He showed us that loving our enemies can be done. He showed us what that love of enemies might look like. And that when we do the same, when we follow in Jesus' footsteps, when we do what he did with Peter, when we do what Ananias did with Saul, then powerful change can and does happen. So let's think long and hard today about our own relationships. Let's think about any who have offended us. It's not always easy to reach out to those who have offended us. Sometimes it's not safe to do so. But at the very least, we can pray for them. We can, and Jesus says we must pray for them. Inspired by Jesus and Peter, inspired by Ananias and Saul, can we reach out to those who have hurt us, offended us, even if that's just in prayer? And I say even, because that's a big deal as well. The scandalous but extraordinary message of Easter is that in the risen Christ, an enemy is not just an enemy, but potentially a friend we haven't yet made. Now, I'm very aware that I say all of this in the context of the horrific invasion of Ukraine. By his own admission, Putin has declared himself not just the enemy of Ukraine, but our enemy. It's personal. He's declared himself the enemy of the whole West. He says that he hates our way of life. He despises what he sees as our weakness and our decadence. Well, if you look at the House of Commons this week, maybe he's got a point. He despises our indulgence of the oppressed and the marginalized. He hates our wokeness, though he loves our wealth, of course. But here's a question. When did you last pray for Putin? When did I last pray for Putin? To pray for somebody is not to excuse what they're doing. It's being faithful to that command of Jesus. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And boy, is he persecuting us at the moment. When did you last pray for Putin? Pray for him. Pray for those religious advisors whispering in his ear, frankly, toxic doctrines. Pray for them too. Because our scriptures teach us that people can change. Simon can become Peter. Saul can become Paul. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This is the heart of our faith. It's not an optional extra somewhere over there. It's at the heart of our faith. The cross demands it. The empty tomb demands it. So how will we respond? Amen.